And we are live. Thank you, folks, for joining us here on early on Monday. I'm Adam Classfeld. You're watching All Rise News, and here with us today, one of the most preeminent political scientists of our time, Norm Ornstein. Very happy that you are here to discuss with us the FCC and the FCC's attack dog, Brendan Carr, the agenda that he has of media deregulation, and how all of this relates to the suspension of Jimmy Kimmel's show on ABC. And I think by now, a lot of folks really understand that there was a pressure campaign, both government and corporate pressure, that led to the cancellation of the suspension, indefinite suspension of Jimmy Kimmel's show. That Brendan Carr said we can do this the easy way or the hard way. There was pressure made to bear by two media conglomerates, Nexstar and Sinclair. Nexstar was seeking a multi-billion-dollar merger with Tegna to become an even larger operator of local markets of television stations across the United States, and needs FCC approval for that to happen. So, Norm, to start things off, if you can just, what are folks not seeing, or hasn't risen to the level of discussion that it should have about the deregulatory agenda, in order to Brendan Carr has been pushing, and as it relates to the suspension of Jimmy Kimmel's show?
Okay, Adam, let's first stipulate that Brendan Carr is operating in a fashion that is unlike any FCC chair that I have seen over many decades. And that includes some going back to the Reagan era who were very much for deregulation. One of the things that a lot of people pay attention to is the demise of the fairness doctrine, which occurred during the Reagan administration. Before the late 1980s, if you were on a public airwave, radio or television, and you had somebody expressing a political point of view, you were obligated to be fair and put on an opposing point of view. And that ended with the Reagan administration. Now, we couldn't do it now anyhow with the rise of social media and the like, but that was very different from saying we can do this the easy way or the hard way, which is the kind of language you would expect from a bunch of mobsters going to a store and demanding protection money. We can do this the easy way, you'll pay us, or we'd hate to see something happen to your store. It could burn down, or very bad things could happen. That's what Brendan Carr is doing, and it is outrageous and against every value of a democracy. And the whole notion that we have independent regulatory commissions that act in the public interest. So let's start with that. But then let's go on to your question and two things that people should be paying more attention to. If you look at I shouldn't use this phrase, but I will, the TikTok of what happened with Jimmy Kimmel. He does his monologue, not much for a day or so. Then a couple of right-wing sources do social media saying they're outraged. And then you get an organized outrage campaign. You get Brendan Carr intervening. But before Disney and ABC acted, the most significant element of this, hearkening back to where you started, was Nexstar, a huge element of the affiliate stations for ABC, saying, we are not going to run that show again, period. And that was followed by Sinclair saying not only would they not run the show, but they would use the time frame to do a memorial for Charlie Kirk. And we're talking about two huge elements for the Disney ABC conglomerate. And that led to the suspension, indefinite suspension of Jimmy Kimmel. It's not clear, by the way, that it was done in conjunction with what his contract allows. And I think he may end up suing for a very large sum of money. So put that into the hopper here. What we had was Nexstar doing this, not, I believe, because they were outraged by what Jimmy Kimmel said, which has been distorted by his opponents, but by the other reality. And the reality there is that we have long had some limits on monopolization of local television and radio stations through Democratic and Republican administrations, capped at any corporate entity being able to own no more than 39% of all the local outlets. To accomplish the merger that Nexstar wants to do with the second largest owner of local television stations, Tegna, would take them well above that 39% level. So Nexstar needs Brendan Carr. Brendan Carr knows that as well. And this FCC meeting that's coming up is going to consider whether they're going to raise or eliminate that 39% level and do it under the guise of deregulation. The second element to this that I think people need to be aware of is that what's happened with ABC and Disney is obviously not the first time that this has happened. ABC outrageously gave in to Trump's demands at the beginning of his administration, demanding $16 million for them by saying that George Stephanopoulos had slimed Donald Trump by saying he had been convicted in a civil court of rape, which was factually true. The judge in that case said that if it didn't meet the very narrow standard of rape, it was no question because it was digital penetration against the wishes of E. Jean Carroll. That met the definition of rape. In a courtroom, ABC would have won probably on a summary judgment, but they caved. CBS caved. Paramount caved. All of these entities are caving to the pressure from the Trump administration, much of it occurring through Brendan Carr, but a lot of it through the lawsuits that Trump is filing. But it all reflects another larger reality, which is to circle back to that 39% rule. We are seeing enormous consolidation across almost every significant communications and news outlet into a handful of either billionaires like Jeff Bezos, Rupert Murdoch, and Larry Ellison and his son David, and huge corporate entities like Paramount and ABC, Warner Brothers Discovery, which now may end up being subsumed into the Paramount entity, which will mean right-wing ownership and influence over both CNN and CBS. And if you take into account networks, cable networks, and social media, and now local television stations, we are heading headlong into a situation that is very similar to what we see in Hungary, in Russia, and other places where money talks and autocrats are able to influence either because the people who own these outlets believe in what they're doing or because the threats go way beyond simply the media outlets that are involved.
I see one of the commentators say, how do we stop any of this? I do want to address that, and we want to get into that in a little bit. But you mentioned an upcoming FCC meeting. This is happening on September 30th in FCC headquarters in Washington, D.C. And on that agenda is a rather euphemistically and innocuously titled item, modernizing broadcast ownership rules, going exactly what you're talking about at media consolidation. One of the rules where they are soliciting public comment is on ownership of local TV stations, that they want to get the public's input as to whether they should abolish rules that would cap local markets, that a single entity can't own more than two stations. How does this tie into what you're saying about media consolidation and the consolidation of power of the Trump administration and its allies?
So there are a couple of elements here. I mean, obviously, they can call this modernization, they can call this deregulation, but it is far more insidious than those terms that on their surface seem either innocuous or positive. This is really an effort to open the door to an easier way of jawboning, influencing, pressuring, threatening major sources of media to do the news the way the administration and the government want them to do the news. If you allow, Nexstar, Tegna have not been like Sinclair, which is basically a right wing operation that uses its local television stations. And we should emphasize that for a significant share of Americans, especially older ones, local broadcast news is their major source for information and news. They've trusted it in the past. And if you have this giant entity, where Sinclair basically has tried to use subterfuge, they do these right wing editorials and news packages, require all their stations to show them where it looks like they're coming from the local station, but they're actually coming from the top down, and they're turning their stations into a sort of hidden version of Fox, often to the right of Fox. But if you take Nexstar and add Tegna to it, then if this administration, Brendan Carr or Donald Trump or God knows who else, Kash Patel, Pam Bondi, pressure that entity with threats of tax action, of arresting executives, of moving in and demolishing a lot of their stations, they're going to respond, but they're going to respond with hundreds more stations than they have now. And if you allow these broadcast entities to have three stations or four in a market, and remember, local television news is mostly three, sometimes four, then you're creating even more of a monopoly influencing the news and tilting it so that what's a requirement in a democracy? The ability to know what's going on, to understand when something is over the line or wrong, which is already under attack, becomes that much more difficult to achieve. Monopolizing the media, every historian of the rise of autocracies and tyranny will tell you, is high on the list of must-dos.
And it's on the agenda for the next meeting. I saw someone ask a little bit earlier, how can the public attend one of these meetings? These meetings are open to the press and public, but they don't actually have some sort of forum for public comment, as I understand it. Can you tell us what happens at a usual FCC monthly meeting? The members of the public who are really concerned about what's happening, media consolidation, how and why should they pay attention to what happens at this meeting?
If you care about somehow maintaining whatever shards we have left of democracy, if you care about people knowing the outrages that are going on, and whether those are outrages like Tom Homan, the head of immigration, taking $50,000 in a paper bag from the FBI on tape, and then having Pam Bondi and the Trump administration say, nothing to see here, we're moving on, much less the fact that after knowing this, they chose him to be the head of immigration. If you care about American citizens having their doors blasted open by masked ICE thugs and mistreated for hours or days, you want to know about them. And if we're not going to know about them, we're not going to be able to do anything about them. So it's very important. Now, I've been to some of these FCC meetings. They're held usually in a small auditorium. The audience that's in there is not particularly big, and it's usually dominated by communications lawyers and those who have a direct interest in them, maybe a smattering of the public who are there. But, it's worth writing your representatives and contacting them. It's worth writing the FCC and the commissioners. Unfortunately, they also have the deck stacked so that this is, whatever Brendan Carr wants, he's going to be able to get through because he has only pliant commissioners, one Democrat in dissent. But frankly, it wouldn't hurt for this meeting to have a large group of demonstrators outside the FCC. That might get some news coverage about how dangerous it is to allow even more huge corporations and billionaires to monopolize our news.
I reached out to a couple of major protest organizers to see if any demonstrations were planned. I'm waiting to hear back on that very issue. One thing that you had mentioned, the massive public action. There have been protests, there have been boycotts, there have been calling campaigns. Profiled them quite a bit on allrisenews.com. The weekly column Rising This Week gives a profile of what's happened. But since I last published that, I want to show some of the headlines that we've seen. More than 400 celebrities have signed a petition protesting the suspension of Kimmel's show. The mayoral candidate from the city of New York, Zohran Mamdani, canceled a town hall on an ABC local station. A Marvel star is boycotting Disney and their calling campaigns to Nexstar, Sinclair, and ABC affiliates around the country. Folks who are fired up about this, who are alarmed about about further consolidation being on the agenda and what these trends have brought so far. How do you recommend they get involved?
I think, there again, we need as much public attention paid to this as we can get. Look, let's face it, Adam, one of the problems we have, which was heralded in 2016 by Trump's, fascist tutor, Steve Bannon, was we know how to deal with the media in this country, the media that are going to try to be fair. We flood the zone, outrage after outrage, day after day, and they don't know how to cover more than one story. So, going back to what I was saying about the bribe given to Tom Homan, and God knows what he's doing now that he's in office, probably taking money and giving contracts to private prisons and others. But that aside, it should have been the scandal of the century, and it was a one-day story. I looked at the front pages of the papers today, not even there. MSNBC is having something on it, but they're dealing with 10 matters at the same time. We have to be able to alert people that this story, which otherwise will be a non-story for the most part, subsumed under many others at the end of September, who knows what else will be on the scandal or outrage agenda. We need to make sure that people understand what Brendan Carr is doing that is authoritarian and wrong-headed and ought to be illegal in nature, and what the consequences are if they take the action that we expect them to take. It's not that we can stop it, but we ought to be able to shed light on it now before it's going to be impossible to shed light on anything.
The Tom Homan story will not be a one-day story here on All Rise News. We're going to be speaking to former FBI agent Frank Figliuzzi tomorrow on that subject. But to your point, Norm, we've heard so much about the very dramatic threat from Brendan Carr. He goes on a right-wing podcast of Benny Johnson and gives that mafioso type warning: do this the easy way or the hard way. And that he did it in front of the camera. It gets some coverage, and here we have a very less dramatic thing that doesn't happen on a MAGA influencer's channel, but happens on a government agency website, where you have the fourth line item of the agenda is modernizing communications. And who's against modernizing? Who's
Sure.
against making
Yeah.
anything modern? Um, how does attention get paid to these very important and influential regulatory decisions that get made in rooms and meetings that don't get a lot of viewership? There's going to be a live stream that probably the broader public isn't aware exists on September 30th. How does that consciousness get raised?
On All Rise News, of course. But, let me add that this is not the only outrage we're seeing from these presumed independent regulatory commissions. The Securities and Exchange Commission, for example, just told 3 individuals who bilked unsuspecting Americans out of billions of dollars, who were on the hook for restitution for those victims, and said, no, you don't have to pay a penny. We have seen many of those just go completely under the radar or be mentioned a little bit and then people move on. That's bad enough. This is even worse. But the
Mm.
fact is, over the many decades that I've been around this town and around these agencies, and more the FCC than any other, is that they rarely get any kind of attention. They're not generally doing things that a more than a sliver of the public understands or pays attention to. And so we have to change that now, because this is a different kind of threat that we face. I'd add one more thing, Adam, which is the challenge here, actually having electronic media actually act the way we want our media to act, to protect democracy, to bring out wrongdoing, to act to advance democratic procedures. Uh, you know, there's a public interest obligation for television and radio broadcasters. It goes back to the Telecommunications Act of 1934. These entities have been given for free public airwaves. These are the airwaves that we own. Some of the airwaves have been auctioned off for large sums of money. These entities don't have to pay them, but in return, they have explicit public interest obligations. Now, back in 1999, when Bill Clinton was president, he asked me and a broadcast executive to co-chair a presidential advisory commission to update the public interest obligations, because we were moving into digital broadcasting. And instead of having, a relatively small number of local stations, a local station was going to be able to have 10, 20, or even more outlets. That's why we have 500 channels or more when you go to cable, for example. So I co-chaired this commission, and we tried to write an updated list of public interest obligations. We actually had a terrific list that was drafted by the great scholar Cass Sunstein. And we had a number of broadcast executives on this commission. They all said, we don't need that. We'll do it voluntarily. And while, that was a questionable assertion, they had enough clout on this commission so that we did not actually mandate or require. And what we learned, of course, was that the existing public interest obligations were rarely exercised by these stations or enforced. In the aftermath of this, I joined together with a veteran journalist named Paul Taylor and Walter Cronkite to try and get, for the 2000 election, just some minimal action in a pledge by broadcasters. They said, we'll do this on our own, for public service announcements to enable real debates of congressional candidates and others, hoping we could get it at least for the 2002 cycle. And with almost no exceptions, including all of these entities who pledged, who promised that they would do it, they did none of it. There is very little adherence, even in the best case scenario, to voluntary action to protect or enhance democracy by these kinds of news sources. And now it's becoming a million times worse because of these thuggish actions on the part of the administration and the greed on the part of the entities that own them.
Mm. And you were talking about the public interest and how so it just reminded me when you had mentioned that particular phrase, Carr himself had been trying to weaponize his vision of what the public interest is. That was when he had that interview with the right wing influencer Benny Johnson, who was previously a journalist whose career tanked in a plagiarism scandal, became a right wing influencer. And Carr, in the same interview where he said the easy way or the hard way, he's talked about abusing that very notion of the public interest. How does the public fight back against that? The very tools that are meant to enhance our democracy being used as a weapon of censorship.
And let's note how utterly inappropriate it is for a chairman of the Federal Communications Commission to appear on the website of a guy who's not just a right-wing influencer, but if I'm not mistaken, was one of those getting money from Russia to put out a point of view that Vladimir Putin liked very much. That's shocking that he would go on and make the threat there, not just make the threat generally. We have to shed, all we can do at this point is to shed as much light as possible. But what we also have to do, Adam, and, it's maybe less at this point the role of individual citizens and more of some of the at least wealthier people on the other side, along with some of our experts, is to make sure that we still have avenues of communication that are going to be fair. And by fair, I don't mean putting out left-wing propaganda to counter right-wing propaganda. I mean reporting what's actually happening and putting it into context. And that also doesn't mean making it all about both sides are the same. So we've got a major challenge ahead of us, and obviously it's not the only challenge. And then to put this into even more context, the fight to rewrite history, what Trump and this administration are doing to sanitize our history, to take out references to slavery, to basically rewrite what happened in the 2020 election. All of that is part and parcel of this set of efforts. It's a multi-pronged war that we're in to try and turn us into a full-blown dictatorship.
And of course, one of the people who was behind Trump's effort to purge some history from the Smithsonian Institute is now his recommendation to replace the prosecutor in the Eastern District of Virginia who refused to push a politically motivated case against Letitia James. Just one note on the point that you mentioned, Norm. You're absolutely right. Benny Johnson was one of the people who received, according to a number of reports, the secret funding from the Russian government last year, and that's a show that Brendan Carr appeared on. Thank you so much for breaking it all down, especially over a topic that hasn't really gotten a lot of attention in the media consolidation piece of the puzzle, and that it's happening at the end of this month. For those who are just joining in right now, the FCC meeting to discuss the latest part of its deregulatory media consolidation agenda is on September 30th in FCC headquarters in Washington, D.C. I will have all the details along with the full recording of this interview if you entered late on allrisenews.com. If you're watching now on Substack Live, hit the subscribe button on the top of the screen. And if you're watching the archive version later on YouTube, just visit www.allrisenews.com for more information about this meeting and about all the issues we've been talking about. Thank you so much, Norm.
You bet, Adam. Great to be with you.
Great to be with you. Bye bye.